So let me come to Ian first. What is your view of leadership, the new models emerging, and the awareness of the current leadership class that they have to change and they have to modernize, they have to change the way they do their business of leadership?
Well, I guess to go from the last session to this session, one piece of good news is if you think you have problems with leadership in Japan, you're doing vastly better than they are at the global level, right? That's where we have leadership challenges. And do I think that folks are aware of this and think that it's something that needs to be addressed soon? I think the answer is no. I think there are a few reasons why we're in this environment that I call the G0. Number one, too many countries. It's just harder to actually get cooperation and coordination when you have so many different actors that matter, who have different electoral systems and different electoral calendars, and just getting a word in edgewise. That's a simple point. The second point is these new countries that matter a lot more today are different, right? Fareed Zakaria talks about the rise of the rest. It's not just the rest. They're different. They're poor. They have different preferences, different priorities. That's okay, but we don't like different. We like same. We don't like the nail sticking up, right? And it's not only that they're different, it's also they don't have capacity. You look at India, they've got 1.1 billion people. And you look at New Zealand, they have 4 million. But India actually has fewer diplomats than New Zealand. Now, we don't expect much from New Zealand. We expect more from India. And even if they wanted to provide global leadership, and they don't, they wouldn't have capacity. And I think about China's multinational corporations. How long have they been global? How many of them are global? Compare that with Japan or the US. How long has Russia had philanthropy? They still don't, right? Compare that with Canada, or compare that with Australia. There's a capacity issue. Third point, the Japanese, the Europeans, historically American allies that have done a lot of the lifting, whether it's economically or politically, help to keep these institutions intact and moving, especially on the economic side, they are distracted. The Europeans are now in year 3 of a crisis that is systemic in Europe and affects their very identity. And all of their collective energies are going into that. When Lagarde speaks at the IMF and says, we need to give the Greeks 2 more years, that's not because she wants to give the Greeks 2 more years. It's because she understands that the Europeans need at least 2 more years to actually get through this crisis. So we're not resolving this soon. The Japanese have a new prime minister every week, right? And no, it makes me want to move here because I could have a shot at cabinet in Japan, right? And other places, that's unlikely. The Japanese aren't interested. I mean, China is focusing the mind, and certainly there is an opportunity. I think there's a watershed moment here that because of collective concern about Japan, maybe you will see the Japanese move more closely and more strongly to figure out what its national interests are. Japan has been ignoring conversations about its national interests for decades now, but still, no time soon. And fourth, the United States doesn't want to do as much of this stuff. I mean, there's a big debate in the U.S. about whether or not the U.S. is in decline. I don't think it's a useful debate, because whatever you think about U.S. decline, whether or not they are, no one wants to bail out the Europeans. They want the Europeans to do that. Whether or not you think America's in decline, no one wants to talk about Afghanistan. They want out, right? Syria is the poster child today for the G0. And we have the Russians and the Turks facing off against each other. They're major powers. And the Americans and the Chinese are largely on the sidelines and will stay on the sidelines. We've had 18 months of war in Syria. It is starting to expand. We have over 20,000 dead. It is clearly very impactful. And the United States want to do nothing. And there are sanctions. But the worst thing that Putin could do, if he really wanted to upset the apple cart, he could go to Obama and say, you know what, I've been irresponsible. I've had a change of heart. And I've been difficult at the Security Council, but I see what's happening in Syria, and so I want to be a part of the solution. So going forward, no more veto. I'm going to support the Security Council, whatever you want to do, Obama. So what do you want to do? And Obama's going to, well, I don't know. I wanted to blame you, Russia. That's what I want to do. that's a problem. So, one, I do see that there is a critical gap in global leadership, that it was never great, but it was much more significant than what we're seeing today. I don't think it's sustainable long term. And no, I don't think that the national leaders, they're very willing to play a strong leadership role in their own neighborhoods in many cases. But when we talk about challenges that are global, we absolutely aren't seeing that.
Victor, I hope you'll address this as well, but let me just pick up with Ian quickly. It's not just new models of leadership. What about the abilities and capacities of leadership to even grip the scale of problems? Because actually most are now navigating in uncharted waters, which go beyond everything they've been trained for and have got experience for. Where do you see this now in terms of the vulnerabilities of leadership?
There are some areas where you still have lots of capacity to lead. You look at global defense and America's ability to provide leadership on defense, given what it spends and given its extraordinary gap with other countries in the world, I think is still there. They just don't want to provide as much, but they don't want to pay for it. But if you ask me on the economic side, I think that the danger is we are allowing the great to be the enemy of the good. We've had all of these global climate summits. They fail. And I was teaching at Columbia, my class the other day, and I asked my students, so how many more summits do we need to have on climate that fail before we realize we should stop having global climate summits? And one of my students said 7, which seemed like as good an answer as any, right? But you know, the point is, we're not going to do climate globally because the countries don't exist. We're going to have to do smaller things.
But the GFC particularly, how that's really pushed the limits of leadership and public officials understanding the scale of what has to be done.
I think very specifically, sitting here in Japan, it is very clear the WTO model is breaking down. We're not going to do a Doha round, but there is an answer, and that answer, which was discussed in the last panel, is more meaningful and durable ties with like-minded countries. That's why the TPP is so important. It should not be limited there. That's why an EU-Japan FTA is important. That's why a TAP, a transatlantic partnership, is important. There are things you can do that matter, right, that are not global. Global would be better, but when global is not happening, you do what you can do. And I think that in many cases, it's precisely those second-best options which are doable that we are not moving more quickly enough on.
All right. Victor, thank you for being patient. Let me come to you and ask you, particularly if you can address those points as well, especially because of your knowledge and inside understanding and personal knowledge of those who are in the Chinese leadership and the scale of challenge that they are facing. We heard about Weibo and 500 million and so on, about how, in your view, leadership is adapting to these new realities.
Yeah. Thank you. Can I make a few general points just to follow some of Ian and Kondu-san's comments, which resonates with me. I think we are sitting here talking about new models of leadership, be it global or regional or local. The answer is we really don't know. I think politics, particularly in the representative democratic world, is under stress. It's not that leaders are not taking risks. It's that the structural and institutional constraint and stress do not allow leaders to take strategic, medium, and long-term decisions. Right? I think that's short-termism that you mentioned, and also the unrealistic expectations of the electorate because of the Twitters of the world, that they express their frustration, probably not thinking carefully, and politicians take it seriously, but because they need to be re-elected in 2 years, 4 years, whatever. So I think now is the time that we probably need a break from rapid changes to really discover or rediscover a consensus on what I would say, I'd like to touch on this on China as well, but really is a consensus on how we should have a fairer and a more efficient distribution of interests around the world. I think basically in the democratic and world, you're talking about the have and have not. You know, the Labour want to have a high minimum wage to defeat inflation. Also, distribution of power between the bureaucracy and the elected officials. and so on and so forth. So I think it is the time to think out of the box. It doesn't work. The existing democratic system does not work in a time of crisis. And the longer we drag on, I think we're going to pay a high price. It'll be huge social unrest, leading to political unrest, and eventually we will have military conflicts. So I think that's my general comments. In terms of China, also, the current system is under stress. Domestically, the challenges are immense. And the new team coming in next month will have to embark upon a process of a new consensus of distribution of goodies. Now, a democratic system gives you a peaceful, transparent way of distributing interests. In the communist system, they do it through their own way. It's behind closed door, but behind the one-party system, they have different fractions of the party. And the feeling now is one or two fractions is taking the lion's shares of the goodies, and that's not sustainable. So what's going to happen with the Dabao Xilai scandal is accelerating the need for reform, for political reform. What does that mean? That the party needs to be cleaned up, because if the party continue to be corrupt, we have no hope for the rest of the country. So what it needs is those fractions need to get together in their own way to find a more sustainable way of distributing power and interests. And you will see a lot of initiatives coming through in 100 days. So I think this new lot coming in, quite a few of them I know personally for over 20 years. And I can honestly say that they are the best we can get in China at the moment. They're all proven, they run big provinces, they are well educated, they're sophisticated, and their heart is in the right place. And in terms of China and Japan relations, again, the 5 likely members going on to the 7 or 9 Standing Committee, they run big provinces, which are very close to Japan. The president-designate have run Fujian, Shanghai, and Zhejiang, huge Japanese interests. The premier-designate has run Liaoning, which is very close to Japan. The vice president-designate has run Jiangsu, and the vice premier-designate has run Beijing, Guangdong, and Hainan. So personally, they have the relationship, the knowledge, and interaction experience with Japan. And that's why I hope that problem that we have right now probably will blow over, and eventually we can come back to some air of stability that hopefully we can work hard to sustain, because China and Japan need to work together. And for Japan to thrive in medium and long term, it has to remain stable and close relationship, not just with the United States, but also with China.
Let me just press you on that. Whether in China or Hong Kong, where you live, or Singapore, or many of these countries now, what do you see, in Vietnam, what do you see as the capacity to understand the enormity of what's changing and the ability to react and adapt in a timely way which maintains confidence in the system?
Well, it's like everywhere else. We are affected very much by the new media. In Hong Kong, recently we had a debate about nationalistic education, and one night, without notice, 120,000 people came out and protest in front of the government. Now, very peacefully, Hong Kong people tend not to waste of time on protests, but they do come out, and the government acted. You know, we don't have a democratic system like you do in Japan. We have a hybrid system. Hong Kong is a free society, but with no democratic, no full democratic election yet. So it's a bit of a hybrid, but people respond, and I think the same you will find. Whether it's in Japan, in China, they will have to respond to grassroots activism.
But what about their capacity and ability to appreciate the enormity of what's changing?
They're beginning to, but the problem is, it's not good enough to be reacting to events. As a leader, you need to preempt. You need to be a visionary. You need to know what the problem is and then make decision either to preempt risk or advance your interests. What I'm saying, the structural constraint of our present system do not allow our leaders to do that.
Do they realize, do you believe, and Ian, come in on this as well, do you think they realize their new vulnerability if they're not seen to act in a timely way, not reacting but preempting as much, foreseeing, because you could say this about European leaders as well, that they're constantly reacting to the latest drama in the financial crisis as opposed to seeing the inexorable way in which it's likely to go and then acting preemptively. But Victor, just again, on Hong Kong, on China, Singapore, Vietnam, what you're seeing there, the capacity of the leadership. After all, the Singaporean government had a shock last year in an election where they lost a significant, like the foreign minister lost his seat, they lost a significant level of support which surprised them and took them, took the wind out of their sails.
And yet, if you talk about strategically minded government, Singapore comes right at the top. If you talk about stability of government, Singapore comes to the top. If you talk about the lack of corruption of the government and the efficiency of the government, Singapore comes at the top. So this is ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's why I'm saying that we are in a crossroad. Even the very best is not good enough. We have to settle down for a few years with national government, people of all parties. Let's not argue on the nonsense. We know what the major problems are. Let's settle down and have a major discussion, whether it's domestically or globally, for a new agenda, a new deal, a new consensus.
Ian, so that question about the capacity of leaders to understand, and we can extend it to Vietnam, we're seeing what's happening in Burma, which in many ways is quite remarkable, and whether in fact this current leadership could be creating the conditions for their disappearance.
Well, look, I do think the Chinese are aware, they're very aware of the challenges that are in front of them. But I disagree that we're at a crossroads. We've been saying that China's at a crossroads for a decade now, maybe more. And the Chinese understand that they are approaching a crossroads. They clearly believe that they can forestall it, and so far they've been effective. The United States is not at a crossroads, certainly not on the deficit, and so they're not dealing with it. The Japanese have not believed that they're at a crossroads. The Europeans do know that they're at a crossroads. They're the one that they're not just muddling in place, they're actually muddling through. Muddling through implies forward motion. The rest of us are muddling in place, including China, in my view. And I don't believe that democracies fail in times of crisis. Actually, I think democracies are showing that they tend not to work well when you pretend to have crisis, but you don't really have crisis. The fiscal cliff, U.S. will deal with it, right? Because that's a real crisis if it hits. They'll deal with it, just like they did in 2008, the Obama and the Bush administration. But short of that, I don't see crisis. I don't feel crisis in Japan. And so as a consequence, I don't see this as a failure of democracy in crisis. I see this as kind of a democracy not doing very well when people are comfortable. Europe has a crisis. The Europeans just got the Nobel Peace Prize yesterday. I think it was deserved. And I think it was deserved not just because of what they've done over the past decades, but because of what they're doing now. The Germans are actually taking this seriously. And yes, it's causing a lot of pain, but ultimately, it's a process that requires both political and economic solutions, and it's going to require very, very painful and, dare I say, very unpopular political decisions. I don't see many people out there taking unpopular structural political decisions outside of Europe, and that's because in Europe they are truly facing a crisis.
You could call the prize a sort of credibility bailout in the current crisis. But Victor, let me just keep pushing you both on the capacity of leadership to respond to the speed of change. It's such a simple question, but it's creating so many complex pressures within governments, whether it be the political leaders. Van Rompuy told me that in his 3 years in office, 17 countries have changed their leaders in the time that he's been there. But when you see what is happening and the pressures, whether it be on the politicians who are thinking of the electoral cycle or government officials who are having to cope with this, where do you see the stresses at the moment?
Well, I try to say this the third time. I take a very different view from Ian. I do think that we are in a crossroad. I'm not suggesting democracy fail. I'm saying the present representative government system where you can't make strategic decisions, where politics are polarized. If we don't start thinking, when the time comes where the time bomb blows up, it's too late. you slip away your opportunity. Now, when we are able to still think and talk and prepare, we have to think of something new, something different. It's the structure. I think the politicians understand the constraint, but they are helpless because the structure. For example, the institutional arrangements for the global architecture that we put in place after the wars, which worked very, very well for many years, today is under stress. And if, you mentioned the WTO. Absolutely. Unfortunately, bilateral or regional trade deals undermine that multilateral global arrangement, which is the best that we have. I agree with you that if we can't have that, we have to go for second best, as regional as possible, so that when we come back to a multilateral arrangement, we can go a seamless way on through trade, right? But I do feel that the present system is so under stress that if we don't start thinking of a different agenda to ease the pain, the opportunity may slip away.
Have you both got anything to put onto that agenda now for discussion here in the next 25 minutes? You say we've got to discuss a new agenda. What's in your mind, Victor, of what needs to be on that agenda?
Well,
and then Ian.
Each country would have their own political and social and cultural dynamics. That I don't think there's one size fits all. Now, for example, in Britain, you get as close to that with a national government. And if there were a national government last time round, and first of all, you know that you have a government that could last for a few years, you can make some medium-term strategic decision to sort out the economic mess, right? That's the kind of thing that is possible for the British context. What's for Japan, what's for China, again, I think we need to observe and respect their own domestic dynamics.
Ian.
For me, it would be economic statecraft. It would be the need for governments to work with private sector companies to make sure that they cannot be divided and conquered, to make sure that they work together, right? I mean, when Toyota has problems, Volkswagen should not be supporting the Chinese perspective on the islands. Volkswagen should not have a perspective on the islands, right? You don't want that. When Google gets kicked out of China, you do not want the CEO of Yahoo to say, well, we're fine, the Google guys are bad. You want one set of standards, right? And if they can't be global, you want them to be as big as possible, but they must be coordinated. This is actually a much bigger problem in the private sector, which is shorter term, dog eat dog, and very, very competitive, and therefore undermining of the system than it is for leadership, than it is a state problem, right? But the states must play a more active role in working with the corporations. Historically, the Japanese are better at this for many reasons than the Americans are, which is important.
Right, let's open it up. Who'd like to jump in? We've got 20 minutes to run. Right, yeah, you've got the microphone closest to you, and then we'll come here. But those critical phrases, politics are under stress, and what Ian's just said here about economic statecraft, trying to join up the dots a bit more.
Hey, thanks very much. Robert Feldman from Morgan Stanley. A couple of the things the speakers have mentioned really struck a nerve with me, or struck a point. One is that we're not going to have global solutions because there are too many players. That said, in the literature for political science, there is a very interesting strain of literature that talks about the evolution of cooperation. How is it that cooperation emerges among individual actors when there is a game theory structure around it? Okay? There's a very interesting literature on this, a wonderful book from 1984, Robert Axelrod, called The Evolution of Cooperation. And the conditions basically come down to a repeated game and a payoff matrix among the groups that encourages people to have a strategy that fosters cooperation. Okay? What are the conditions for that? Basically, you look at what happens when, if I do X and he does Y, what's my payoff? If I do X and he does Z, what's your payoff? Okay? And then both actors look at this. There's a lot of mathematics involved in it. But under standard conditions, the normal result is that cooperation emerges if there's a tit-for-tat solution between the two. Okay? So it can emerge as long as the payoff matrix is structured properly. That's where the incentives in democracy come into play. Okay? Second, what are some of the characteristics of a winning strategy in this payoff matrix? First, don't shoot first. If you shoot first, you usually lose. That's one of the characteristics. Second characteristics, if they shoot at you, shoot back. Okay? Third characteristic, if they stop shooting, you stop shooting. And the last one is be totally transparent about 1, 2, and 3. Okay? Those are the conditions that make for a winning strategy. We've just seen a good example of that in the dispute over the islands. Part of this time, the previous time as well, is when the U.S. sent senior officials to Beijing, and they basically said, if you shoot, we shoot back. And that put things back on the track to calm down and get to the rest of the solution. So there's some pretty good example that the game theory literature does help us figure out what to do. Okay, how do we change the payoff matrix? That has to do with some rules of democracy. In my view, as a loyal American citizen, I think the poster boy for bad democratic institutions is the U.S. Senate. Okay? Terribly undemocratic, very hamstrung by internal rules. It's blocked a lot of things. There are a lot of candidates for being the worst democratic institution around, but the Senate is certainly up there among them. There are a few others around as well. So we need to change the incentives for the politicians so that they can have the ability to do the right thing and not lose their seats. Okay? So that's the democratic incentives. On the role of technology in there, it's very, very important. What's interesting to me is that 120,000 people could come out in Hong Kong, demonstrate against something, and get the rule changed in a system that is not democratic. Maybe China is more democratic than the United States or Japan, because the feedback from the population to the decisions on leadership was actually pretty good in this case. So we have to figure out that democracy is not necessarily about elections, although it's a good system relative to others. It's about feedback from the population, how that feedback mechanism works. Okay? Why was it this time that we didn't have the same result in Hong Kong that we had in Tiananmen 20 years ago? Okay? Something is different. Okay? And finally, on the role of technology and common identities, I think this is also very important. If we're going to have cooperation among countries, we need a common identity, a common problem. Okay? Right now, as I was talking with Ian before, I think he didn't agree with me on this, but we seem to identify common identity among countries as having some other country as the enemy. I think this is a very destructive way to define common identities. What we need to do is define common problems that we can work together on. And to me, again, disagreement about this, I think the biggest one is energy. Over the next 50 years, at current, if you take the current, or the energy use of the last 20 years, year by year by year, 1.5% total primary engineering, say that continues for the next 50 years, only 50 years. I remember things that happened 50 years ago. It's not that long, okay? 7.4 trillion barrels of oil equivalent. Current reserves, 7. There's a problem. So if our common destiny is to try to solve this energy problem, we can work together. Okay? That's the way we have to define a destiny to make this cooperation system work. I think I've gone over a little.
Thank you very much. And of course, there was one example in Washington, the SOPA, that bit of legislation which was brought down in a week by the internet. So it's not unique to Hong Kong. It's happening in many places, including in the US. Please, yeah. Who else wants to come in? We've got 20 minutes to run. Do please put up your hand, and 3 or 4. Get the microphone to you. Microphone at the back, but first here.
Thank you. I'm Seiji Kondo, Commissioner for Cultural Affairs. I think both democracy and market economy seem to be in failure, not because the system is wrong, not because of the failure of the leaders to use those systems. It is because of the public and the investors who are not well equipped, who are not well educated to use those systems, because those systems are neutral. If wrong people use it, it can fail. If right people use it in the proper way, it works well. So we have failed to enlighten the public to be equipped with the ability to use those systems properly. How can we address this? This is a big problem, how to restore morale and the ability to operate those excellent systems, the best systems we have ever developed.
Victor,
Even Adam Smith says that market economy works only when people preserve morale. So this is the key issue for the the entire world.
Victor and Ian, do you want to pick up either of those points immediately? No? Okay. Right, over there.
Hi, I'm Christina, full-time Globus student. So I totally agree that democracy works in good and stable times, as Ian said, and sorry, that's a minute. Yep. So democracy works in good and stable times, and like how in the U.S. when the 99%, the Occupy Wall Street, they stood up and they got the power, but they but they lack a visionary leader to give them what is their goal. So they got the power, but it didn't have a decision, and that faded out. And then I agree on that the politician needs to focus on the real things on the agenda, and they need new things on the agenda. They need to focus on the real problems. So in Hong Kong, I think on the education reform, I don't think the problem is that they don't want civic education. I grew up in Hong Kong, and I think we need civic education because Hong Kong doesn't have the history. You need to learn from both the British side and the China side. So when China took control of Hong Kong in 1997, I think they need to implement civic education. So the problem is not that we don't want education, but what is in the content. Hong Kong people are afraid that they're going to change the content and start brainwashing everyone. And then my question is, the real problem politicians should be focused on, do you think Senkaku Island is a real thing to be focused on for Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan?
Victor?
I'm very grateful to you for that question. Absolutely. The Hong Kong, those 120,000 people, most of them do not disagree that Hong Kong needs to know more about China. I think, as you say, it's certain contents in the government's sponsored reference manual that cause people to worry. They could be brainwashing, like you have to be so emotional when the Communist Party's flag is when the national flag is those Hong Kong is not used to that, and I think that's the kind of objection that we have. If you analyze rationally, there are only three ways of resolving the territorial dispute. Either the parties submit themselves to international arbitration, or the parties move on and based on the 1972 consensus, and let's not argue, but let's try to share the economic benefit and potential together. Or failing all that, there will be military conflict. It will be a military solution, right? Now, military conflict is lose-lose. International arbitration is win-lose, because one party win, the other lose. Whereas sharing economic benefit will be win-win. So rationally, I think parties understand that. Secondly, the Chinese new leadership coming in, understanding the domestic challenges are so immense, they also want to get a period of stability to sort out their domestic problems. The last 30 years, Chinese leaders had a lot of room to maneuver because the West sympathized the reform program, they support it, and there's no, in terms of international relations, China had a quite a smooth ride. But the next 10, 20 years, the external relations is going to be a lot more complex because the psyche from the rest of the world on China's rise or behavior is controversial. So I think they need all the stability they need to sort out domestic problems. So also there's a common interest to get back to stability as soon as possible, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I would say I'm very sympathetic to everything Victor just said. But I think that there's a fourth option, and that fourth option is that there's actually not enough interest to resolve the issue because both are playing different games, right? Game theory solutions don't work when you're playing different games. And the Chinese government is not just trying to figure out a resolution to the conflict. They're also trying to stay in power. And frankly, of all of the things that they can use to push off the crossroads that they want to avoid, I mean, you know, a round of anti-Japanese demonstrations in 100 cities, I don't know if that buys them a year or 6 more months or 18 more months, but it's something. It doesn't lose them time, it buys them time. And I also think the critical point that was raised before by Kondo-san of, who is using the democratic tools or the internet or the rest is really, really important. And to the extent that increasingly you've got 540 million Chinese on the internet and millions more all the time, if you were to have more democracy, more representativeness in China, thought experiment, would that lead you to a more nationalist China? Or would it lead you to a China that is more moderate and more seeking of stability than what you presently have? I'd like to suggest there's at least a good chance that it's the former, in which case, increasingly, you will not see these countries playing the same game. And that doesn't lead you to peaceful outcomes. It doesn't lead you to war, but it leads you to much more conflict. It leads you to frenemies. We've got a lot more frenemies out there. In the Soviet Union, the US was really easy. You had friends, you had enemies. Today, there are a lot of folks that you have interdependence with that actually you increasingly have very problematic conflicts because a lot of your interests aren't shared. And you don't want to play the same game with them. We're going to see a lot more of that, in my view.
I think in these discussions, we have to be cautious not to assume that the democracy as we understand it is the solution and the best in everything. Right? I mean,
Well, could you redefine it? I feel uncomfortable. We throw out democracy, but what about political representation or popular representation?
No, I'm not
just
disagreeing.
I'm trying to help fashion and focus where you're trying to get to.
What I'm saying, form different structures of government or political system. The end result is that you want to deliver the good to your people. Okay, you want to deliver. You want to get legitimacy, and you want to deliver the good. I think democracy is only one form of systems that's available to different parts of the world, right? Different, as Robert said, if you use the purest form of democracy, one can argue that the American system has a lot of room for improvement as well. Now, the Chinese system in the last 30 years, they have proven they have raised 400 million people above poverty line, and that is their legitimacy. Going forward, they are now searching on what are the systems that can improve the participation of the public, that they can continue to sustain delivering the goods to the people. Now, you have to believe those guys going into the standing committee, they may change, but the people that I've known for 25 years, they really feel that is the mission. They want to take China to a new era, delivering the goods for more thriving, more open type of China. These are the five of the 7 or 9 people going into power.
What I'm going to raise with you now, I think if we'd raised it a year or two ago, would have been seen in an environment like this as hypothetical. But let me focus on Burma and North Korea, because this time last week, my colleague Stephen Saka interviewed Thein Sein at the UN General Assembly, and he said he could envisage the time when Aung San Suu Kyi becomes president. Now, a year ago, we could never have even thought about that, or 2 years ago. We know what they've been doing very, very cleverly behind the scenes to sort of work out how they can move forward. But now we've got a 29-year-old leader of North Korea. Let me ask you and others in the room to sort of move forward, because this affects Japan in so many ways in terms of where Japan's putting its development money, and also because of your concerns about the security threat from North Korea. And given what happened with the North Korean failed rocket launch a few months ago, when very quickly they confirmed it had been a failure, which is unusual, and there are now mobile phones in North Korea. You can't phone out of the country. Let me ask you, I mean, you're having to make investment decisions, Victor. And Ian, what's your assessment of where this kind of thing is moving now? Because it does raise critical questions strategically in this region about leadership. Victor.
I think the jury is still out. I think on Burma, right? We like what is happening. We would like to support the reform agenda. The World Economic Forum is bringing its East Asia Summit next June to Burma, and that's part of our effort to support the reform agenda. But whether there will be rocky roads ahead, I'm sure. Right? So I think the jury is still out, but I think we should do everything possible to support it. North Korea, I hope that it doesn't I mean, the immediate priority is sustainability. I think, apart from anything else, whether the populace there have enough to fed itself is a humanitarian priority, I think, rather than a political priority.
When a civilian general says this is irreversible in Burma, and the Speaker of the House says this is irreversible, given that we're talking about new models of leadership, is this an extraordinary level of almost contrition, humility, but a practical assessment of how a country can now begin to move forward in a positive way, both in terms of development, economic prospects, and so on, Ian?
Well, I mean, if Aung San Suu Kyi hadn't already gotten a Nobel, you would have certainly made a good argument that yesterday, you would have given a joint Nobel for moving towards reconciliation in Myanmar. I think it's very impressive. I think it's promising. It is early days, but it's real.
But if they say irreversible, do the generals mean it, do you believe?
Nothing is irreversible. I think that they are right now acting with real intent? The answer is yes. I believe that. Do I think that that will continue without potentially very, very big bumps that could derail the entire process? I'm not sure. But I feel good about it. I feel pretty. I think I'm a little more enthusiastic than Victor on this. Maybe not a lot, but a little. On North Korea, yeah. I mean, the question of sustainability. I got to tell you, if you had told me that you were going to, in very short order, Kim Jong-il was gone, and suddenly you're going to have a 28-year-old, now 29-year-old running the country, and that would be as peaceful so far as it has been, I would have said no, it's not. Not on the basis of knowing what's happening in North Korea, but just because of the crushing poverty, the fact that information is increasingly getting in, and hard to manage this transition. Thank God it's going well so far, but the potential for North Korea to blow is not small. And, Seoul is right there. So I think it's one that we have to manage. It's one of the areas that the frenemies, the big frenemies, U.S. and China, we actually have this one really in common. And I think we have the capacity to work together if things get ugly. But there'll be a lot of mutual mistrust. And this is what really worries. If North Korea blows, even though the U.S. and China will want to keep this stable, because the military relations are so bad between the two countries, because they are at cyber war with each other, and there's very little communication on that, the presumption will be that everything the Chinese are doing from the U.S. side, they'll presume the worst. And the Chinese will presume the worst from the United States as well. And that makes this much more dangerous.
Anyone want to come in quickly? We've got 5 minutes left. Please. Was that a wave or you'd like the microphone? All right, waving at a friend. Well, anyone not waving at a friend who'd like the microphone?
Thank you very much. I listened to the panel very interestingly, but I still not successfully in grasping what is the criteria or what is the elements for what you call new models of leadership. So I'd like to hear from panel what is the necessary criteria for new models of leadership, or even traditional leaders could be totally new in this new world.
Do leaders realize they've got to have a new model of leadership when they're facing 120,000 on the streets spontaneously, or in Singapore, or in Vietnam, or in Burma? Do they realize they've got to have a new model as they do now in Myanmar? Victor?
Absolutely. I think they're clever people. No, what I'm suggesting is we don't really know what the answer is. That's why I think we need to put parties together. Don't fight for irrelevant things, just for pure politics. Let's, in some country, you can have a government of all parties that can try to talk to all stakeholders, including the young generation, to find a new design or new architecture, a new deal, a new model for distribution of interest. China has to do that in the next few years in order to survive. The current model, again, is not sustainable. But what it is, I think we need to find out. I don't believe there's one model that suits everybody.
Is one developing? Is one developing?
No. I mean, what I'm suggesting is that we should start thinking, and different country may have the different dynamics, different needs, different requirements.
Ian?
I think that our experience historically is that while we say that we should, we don't until it's more urgent. And so therefore they won't in China. And we won't in the United States. We are in Europe. In Europe, a new model of leadership is being developed. And I feel
But forced by a crisis.
forced by a crisis. When you're talking about something that's that different, that requires that much of a shakeup from so many vested interests who are powerful. The Chinese leaders are powerful. They're very vested. They're worth a lot of money. To get them to change that crossroad better be really, really imminent and urgent. And even then, a lot of them may say no. I completely agree with Victor. Democracy is not the only way to go. By the way, one thing that I found interesting about this week in Japan is that I think that there is a presumption that while China relations are bad now and they're probably going to get worse, there's a presumption that in the long term, China will eventually become a democracy. They will eventually politically and economically reform. I think that is plausible. I do not in any way think that is inevitable. I think there are many other paths the Chinese can take, many of which are deeply problematic for Japan and for the world, and we need to explore and understand them.
Well, let's set aside the word democracy for a moment. Keep the microphone.
Yeah.
What will produce, what is in your mind about public representation or political representation or popular representation? What is in your mind about the halfway, the middle ground that could be developing here somewhere?
Well, look, I think the middle ground in China is that...
Not just in China, but elsewhere.
Over the world. Well, in some places there is. In the United States, a middle ground is not developing. The problem in the U.S. is not top-down. The problem in the United States is that you have very, very large percentage of the population that is disenfranchised from the political process, disenfranchised from vested interests that have a lot of money. No middle ground is developing. And it's not developing because just like in Japan, in the United States you had Occupy Wall Street and nobody cared because the average American was quite comfortable. In Tunisia, the average Tunisian was not quite comfortable. I think in Egypt, the middle ground of governance is actually developing. And that middle ground is, you've got the Muslim Brotherhood, which actually does reflect the sentiment of the people, but you also have the military that really does have power, and they're trying to find a way to work together. You know what, that's really messy. It's really messy. Remember when the Egyptian, when Morsi, the new president, he dissolved parliament, and then the military said, no, you can't. And Morsi came back and said, actually, yes, I can. And for a couple of days, we didn't know what was going on. Well, when you're trying to figure out a new development, a new model of leadership, truly a new, you find yourself in this very, very uncertain, messy, and very context-specific, state-specific, time-specific place. It will be equally different in all of the places that experience it. But let's be very clear. Most of the world right now is not addressing, and for very good reasons is not addressing, how to move to that new leadership, because there isn't that kind of crisis. The G0 doesn't create it.
Victor, finally, do you have a phrase yet which begins to let us understand what could be the middle ground where it's not full democracy, as we tend to assume, but there's something else which satisfies the public, satisfies the politicians as well?
I think we must allow politics to run in at least a medium term, so that leaders, elected officials, have the freedom to take strategic decisions, take some risks. Right now, it's not that they're not willing to take risks. They can't take risks. It's very similar in the corporate world too. Quarterly returns does not encourage CEOs to take long-term strategic decisions. So we have to get away from that.
Victor, thank you very much, and Ian, thank you very much as well. You can see the sandwiches are arriving, and I'm not going to take a risk of extending this for another hour. So, Yoshi, why don't you wind up?
Thank you, Nick, Ian, and Victor. It has been fascinating to be discussing about this issue in Tokyo, and this is like a Davos-type conferences with open discussion and tough questions. And first of all, I'd like to thank Akira for bringing together for this kind of great conferences. And also I'd like to thank panelists, Victor, Ian, Nick, and also Hasegawa-san and Sir David for participating as panelists. I'd like to thank volunteer staffs for helping make this conference possible. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank all the audiences who have participated and actually contributed to the discussion. Thank you very much for coming. This discussion on new model of leadership is a tough one. We have been discussing this at Global Agenda Council for the past 1 year, and we have identified issues that there's lots of changes going on in terms of globalization, technology, generation, and also multi-stakeholder issues, so that climate change as well as Euro, it's so difficult to solve. And therefore, we think that there is a new model leader is required. On top of it, because of Twitters and Facebook, people are wanting to see the news. People want to have the responses quickly. That happened after the Fukushima event. That Prime Minister had to come into the public in about 1 or 2 hours, and the system was not used to it. And therefore, it seems like a new model leaders are needed to have 3 things we are thinking about. One is about the warm heart, which is EQ, like a good emotional connection with people. Second is intellectual capacity to be able to find what's going on and make a decision. And thirdly, you need to have a very good communication because of Twitters and Facebook and social media. It's becoming more eminent that you have to be a very good, smart communicator to be able to cater to the needs of the people and at the same time convince people that this is a good direction to go. So thank you very much for coming. It has been a very fascinating discussion. We're going to have lunchtime so that the discussion will go on. And we'd like to thank all of you for coming once again. Thank you very much.